Padmé Amidala stood in her senatorial apartment on Coruscant late into the evening, her gaze fixed upon the endless streams of lights that defined the city-planet's skyline. Countless airspeeders hummed past, each set of shining beacons weaving a tapestry of motion against the perpetual glow of the sprawling metropolis. She had just returned from a grueling day in the Senate, one that had revealed disturbing undercurrents of fear and tension. Whispers of separatist movements were spreading through the halls of power, and the cloud of uncertainty left her on edge. Yet it was not the day's political drama alone that weighed on her heart. There was something else tugging at her consciousness, a sense of unease tied to the Supreme Chancellor himself. She was not one to give in to paranoia, yet she could no longer ignore the persistent feeling that something was gravely amiss with Chief Palpatine. She had known Palpatine for years, ever since she had first become Queen of Naboo. He had once been a mentor figure, a fellow Nabooan whose keen political insight had guided her through some of her most trying times. He had seemed, back then, so warm, so kind, and so firmly rooted in principle. Over time, especially after the crisis with the Trade Federation, the bond between them had deepened in a professional sense. While she could not claim to be his closest confidant, she had believed she knew his intentions well enough to trust him. Even after he rose to the esteemed position of Supreme Chancellor, she had retained that belief. But now, late at night, staring at the city lights from behind the protective glass of her apartment, she felt as though a hidden shadow was creeping up around her, beckoning her to look deeper into the man who was leading the Republic. 2 nights before, she had been returning from a small diplomatic gathering. She had gone alone, declining her usual entourage for fear of drawing attention. The galaxy was in flux, and she preferred discretion on her personal outings whenever possible. While making her way back through a quiet corridor in the Senate building, she overheard voices. She recognized Palpatine's distinct tone, a methodical and measured cadence that she had come to associate with cunning intellect. But there was another voice, one dark and rasping, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. She did not catch words, not exactly, for they spoke in some cryptic code or language she did not fully recognize. Yet the tension and the malice laced within those murmurs chilled her to the bone. At first, she dismissed it as a private conversation about some Senate intrigue. But as she lingered in that dim hallway, carefully hidden behind a tall archway, she felt something far more disturbing. As the conversation continued, Palpatine's voice slipped into a harsh whisper. There was a subtle shift in his tone that startled her. It was that shift that made her heart race, the distinct transformation of the mild-mannered Chancellor into someone else entirely. When he spoke in this new voice, there was a predatory, almost triumphant air to his words, though she only caught fragments. Names like Dooku, references to the Jedi, cryptic mentions of certain star systems. It was enough to rattle her. She heard the name Sidious uttered once, perhaps more. Padmé was no stranger to rumor. She had heard speculation in the corridors of power about a mysterious Sith presence. She recalled reading about the tragic history of the Sith in the archives on Naboo, remnants of ancient conflicts that had nearly destroyed the Republic centuries ago. She was no Jedi, but she knew enough to fear any mention of Sith. For the next day, she wrestled with the possibility that maybe her mind was simply exhausted, and perhaps she had misheard. And yet, she could not shake the memory of Palpatine's voice adopting that menacing edge. She tried to tell herself it was stress, but she was too methodical and too cautious to let the matter rest. So, she researched carefully and quietly. She began with Palpatine's legislative records, looking for hints or clues that might show a pattern of malicious or manipulative behavior. And while she found the usual political cunning, nothing was overtly damning. Then she dug deeper into his personal history, data logs from the time he served Naboo, and even rumors from the lower levels of Coruscant. What she discovered there sent chills coursing through her. There were references to obscure transmissions from distant star systems, encrypted communications that seemed to point to clandestine dealings. While it was not unusual for a leader of his rank to hold secret correspondences, after all, the galaxy was filled with plots and sensitive negotiations. Some of these transmissions were older, predating his tenure as Chancellor. A handful dated back to when he had first been a modest senator from Naboo. They were directed to individuals whose identities were masked by false names. Cross-referencing them led nowhere. She tried reaching out to some of her most trusted political contacts, but they also hit dead ends or claimed ignorance. It seemed that whoever or whatever Palpatine was communicating with had been extremely careful to leave no trace. Late one evening, she found a small mention of a name, Sidious. It was buried in a heavily encrypted set of references to far-flung outposts in the Outer Rim territories. The data logs showed shipments of resources, from specialized cloning technology to advanced weaponry. The sender's alias was listed as Sidious, and the receiver's identity was even more vague, just a set of numeric codes. Padmé was at a loss. No official channel recorded any such figure, and it was suspiciously absent from all mainstream archives. Her instincts told her that Sidious was no benign entity. The hush in Palpatine's voice that fateful night, combined with these hidden messages, left her with a dawning horror. Could it be that Sheev Palpatine, the most powerful man in the Republic, was someone else entirely? A puppet master orchestrating events from the shadows? Disturbed by the gravity of what she was uncovering, she decided to consult someone with knowledge beyond her own. She thought first of Obi-Wan Kenobi, whom she trusted deeply. Yet Obi-Wan was off on a mission in the Outer Rim, dealing with rumored insurgencies that had connections to Count Dooku. The timing could not have been worse. Her next thought was to speak with Mace Windu or Yoda, or even to approach the entire Jedi Council. But the fear of being dismissed, or worse, the fear that Palpatine might discover her suspicions before she could prove them, held her back. The Chancellor held tremendous sway, and if he indeed was a sinister figure, Sidious, exposing him without solid proof would be nearly impossible. She resolved to gather evidence carefully and to proceed with the utmost caution. Her search led her down many winding corridors of Coruscant's underbelly. She spoke to data slicers who operated outside the law, quietly commissioning them to dig up any leads on the alias Sidious. Most came back with nothing, shrugging helplessly. Those who did claim to have heard the name Sidious spoke of him in hushed tones, as though they referred to a ghost or a demon that walked among them unseen. One slicer, who went by the handle Red Bite, told her in a tense whisper that Sidious was rumored to be the hidden puppet master behind certain criminal syndicates, that bribes and blackmail kept any real information from surfacing. Padmé felt her heart sink with each whispered revelation. The notion that the head of the Republic could be connected to such vile activities was almost too overwhelming to believe. But she had to believe it because all roads seemed to lead there. The slices of information she managed to collect painted a chilling picture. Sidious appeared to have been quietly fueling unrest across the galaxy, supporting some shadowy network of alliances, from the Trade Federation to other corporate powers. Resources were being funneled to various extremist factions, seeding discontent among the star systems that felt neglected by the Republic. It was a careful, methodical operation, one that could certainly lead to widespread conflict if left unchecked. And it made sense in a horrifying way. It explained why the Senate seemed more divided than ever, and why certain star systems had grown emboldened in their threats of secession. It also explained why many senators who opposed Palpatine's initiatives found themselves marginalized or outright discredited. Her nights were restless. She would lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the hum of Coruscant's traffic outside a constant reminder that life went on, oblivious to the dark secret she was unveiling. Sometimes she questioned whether she might be mistaken, whether this was some elaborate mix-up. She wanted to be wrong. She wanted to believe that Palpatine remained the wise elder statesman who fought for peace. But each new clue added weight to the argument that he was, in fact, Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord rumored to be shaping the galaxy in his twisted image. She had uncovered references to the Sith, mentions of old legends that described how a Sith master named Darth Plagueis once had the power to manipulate life itself, eventually passing on forbidden knowledge to an ambitious apprentice. The puzzle pieces suggested Palpatine was that apprentice, grown in power and cunning, biding his time until he could dismantle the Republic from within. She found no direct mention of Plagueis in the official archives, at least not in connection to Palpatine. But she did see references to an ancient Sith lineage, and how apprentices often turned on their masters to claim the mantle of Dark Lord. The idea that Palpatine might have been tutored by a Sith master and then assumed the role of Darth Sidious in secret was too unnerving to dismiss. The historical pattern of cunning and betrayal among the Sith made it plausible, especially for someone so politically astute. Her mind raced with the potential implications. If a Sith Lord truly held the highest office in the Republic, then no one was safe. Not the Jedi, not the politicians, and certainly not the countless citizens who believed in the Republic's ideals. She quickly realized she needed to confide in someone before the burden became unbearable. Gathering her courage, she reached out in the most discreet way possible to Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan. Bail was one of the few senators she trusted implicitly, someone whose moral compass was unwavering. Late one night, under the guise of discussing routine legislative matters, Padmé invited him to her apartment. The moment he crossed the threshold, the tension in her living room was palpable. She had drawn the blinds, dimmed the lights, and activated an advanced security scrambler purchased from a clandestine source in the underlevels. Anything to ensure that no listening device, no hidden camera, and no prying eyes could intrude. She explained her suspicions, her evidence, her fear. Bail listened in stunned silence, his expression growing more grave with each sentence. She could see he was trying to remain rational, to weigh her words carefully. Yet by the time she had finished, his face was a mask of solemn determination. He admitted that he too had noticed some unsettling patterns in Palpatine's governance. His uncanny ability to maneuver Senate votes, to predict or orchestrate crises that served to expand his authority. Bail confessed he had worried that the Chancellor was on a dangerous path, but never in his wildest nightmares had he guessed it might be a Sith infiltration. Though shaken, he pledged to stand by her side. Their conversation ended with an oath. They would bring this to the Jedi Council, but only once they had undeniable proof. Too many senators were in Palpatine's thrall, and any premature action would surely fail. The following week, Padmé's challenge intensified. The Senate was on edge, with daily rumors of secessionist movements gaining ground under the leadership of Count Dooku. Already, some star systems were rallying behind this new confederacy of independent systems, claiming the Republic was corrupt and that the bureaucracy had stifled any meaningful reform. The irony was painful. She suspected that the very corruption fueling these grievances emanated from the office of the Chancellor himself. Palpatine, in his public persona, feigned concern for unity, calling for a measured response. He proposed limited military expansions, just enough, he claimed, to deter open conflict. Many senators rallied behind him, praising his willingness to maintain peace while acknowledging the need for defense. But Padmé saw the underlying ploy. Palpatine was sowing the seeds of war, and he was doing it brilliantly. Every day, she encountered Palpatine in the Senate corridors or during official briefings. He was as courteous as ever, greeting her with a gentle smile and fatherly concern for her well-being. The contrast between his public demeanor and what she suspected he did in secret made her stomach churn. She forced herself to keep her composure, responding with polite pleasantries, never betraying that she saw past his facade. But with each such encounter, her conviction deepened. She saw the coldness in his eyes, the calculating glint that belied his genial words. She saw how his attention would sometimes linger on her with a curious intensity, as though he were testing her. She kept her face neutral, but privately she burned with dread. Finally, after careful planning, she and Bail managed to contact Obi-Wan Kenobi upon his brief return to Coruscant. They arranged a clandestine meeting in one of the unassuming conference rooms tucked away in the labyrinthine lower levels of the Jedi Temple. Obi-Wan arrived, weary from his mission, and listened intently to what they had to say. Padmé noticed the subtle shift in his expression as they spoke. The tensing of his jaw, the flicker of shock in his eyes when they mentioned the possibility that Palpatine was a Sith Lord. He asked for details, pored over the evidence Padmé had managed to collect, and considered their testimonies. She watched as he stroked his beard, eyes narrowing in concern. Obi-Wan wanted to go immediately to the Jedi Council, but Padmé and Bail cautioned restraint. They argued that the Council might need more definitive proof, and that Palpatine likely had ears even within the temple. A direct accusation could put them all in danger, or lead Palpatine to accelerate his plans before they could prepare. They needed a strategy, something that would unveil Palpatine's hand in a manner he could not deny or cover up. Obi-Wan frowned, torn between loyalty to the Council and the need for discretion. Ultimately, his trust in Padmé prevailed, and he agreed to keep their conversation secret for the time being. He pledged to do some investigations of his own, using his position within the Jedi Order to see if he could confirm their suspicions. The days that followed were a flurry of guarded collaboration. Under various pretexts, Obi-Wan accessed archived Jedi records that detailed ancient Sith teachings. He found references to Darth Plagueis, who had once manipulated the Force in unnatural ways, and he noted how the lineage of Sith Masters passed knowledge from one to the next. The name Sidious appeared only once, in a scattered prophecy recorded by a long-deceased Jedi seer. It spoke of a shadow in the east who would rise to topple the Republic from within. The seer had scribbled the name Sidious, along with dire warnings of a future shaped by war and the downfall of the Jedi. The text was cryptic, nearly incomprehensible, but it sent a chill through Obi-Wan's entire being. He also uncovered vague references to a potential connection between Count Dooku, once a Jedi himself, and this figure named Sidious. He fed these findings back to Padmé and Bail, fueling their determination. Yet they still had nothing that would unequivocally tie Palpatine to Sidious. The Chancellor was too shrewd, covering his tracks with impressive skill. Meanwhile, the political situation in the Senate grew dire. Cries for the creation of a grand army of the Republic echoed across the chamber. Senators like Orn Free Taa demanded immediate protection against the Separatists, while others, like Mon Mothma, cautioned that militarization could lead to the exact catastrophe they sought to prevent. Palpatine played both sides like a maestro, carefully shaping the debate so that he appeared to be the voice of reason amid chaos. He downplayed the crisis just enough to appear moderate, while subtly stoking the flames of fear that made a centralized military seem indispensable. Padmé watched it all with mounting horror. In the midst of this chaos, an unexpected event rocked the capital. An assassination attempt on Padmé herself. She had anticipated that Palpatine might move against her once he suspected she was prying too much. Late one evening, as she returned from a committee meeting, her speeder was ambushed by droids bearing the insignia of the Trade Federation. Her guard detail fought valiantly, but the fight was brutal, with heavy blaster fire in the claustrophobic confines of a skyway tunnel. Padmé ducked low in the speeder, heart pounding, as sparks flew and the air filled with the acrid scent of overheated blaster barrels. Eventually, reinforcements arrived, forcing the droids to flee, but not before 3 of her security officers lay gravely wounded. She was unhurt but thoroughly shaken, her mind racing with the question: had Palpatine orchestrated this to silence her? The official investigation pointed to separatist elements, claiming that agents of Count Dooku wanted her eliminated because she was a vocal advocate for negotiations over war. Padmé sensed that it was more complicated than that. Perhaps it was a move by Sidious to sow further confusion or to remove a meddlesome thorn in his side. Her conviction that Palpatine was behind it grew stronger. Yet ironically, Palpatine himself seized the moment to publicly denounce violence, lamenting how the Senate was endangered by extremists. He offered her personal condolences, his words laced with sincere regret. Standing in the Senate rotunda, he spoke of Padmé's bravery and how crucial voices like hers were in maintaining the spirit of democracy. To the broader audience, he appeared a champion of peace. Padmé saw only a cunning manipulator flaunting his duplicity. She confronted him subtly during a quiet interval after a Senate session. Approaching him by the tall windows that overlooked the city, she inquired whether he had any leads on who might be responsible. His face remained as placid as ever, the slightest flicker of curiosity passing through his eyes as he answered that the intelligence services were still investigating. He made it clear he was deeply troubled by the assault. Though his words seemed genuine, Padmé detected the faintest hint of satisfaction in his gaze, as though he was savoring a private knowledge. She forced a thin smile, thanked him, and walked away, her mind spinning with the memory of that sinister voice in the corridor. At last, Obi-Wan returned with an urgent update. He had discovered that Count Dooku, now known publicly as the leader of the Separatist movement, had been in contact with a Sith Lord named Sidious, or so he had gleaned from a coded message intercepted by Jedi intelligence. While the Jedi were investigating, they had not yet realized Sidious's potential identity. Or if they suspected Palpatine, they had no evidence strong enough to act on it. Obi-Wan also warned Padmé that Dooku was rumored to have once been approached by Palpatine back when Dooku was a Jedi. The timeline was fuzzy, but if indeed Dooku had turned to the dark side, it implied that Sidious's infiltration of the Jedi ranks went deeper than anyone had imagined. Padmé and Bail resolved that they could wait no longer. They needed a direct confrontation, or at least some covert operation that would unravel Palpatine's deception. They devised a plan with Obi-Wan to lure Palpatine into a communication that could be traced, revealing his connection to Dooku and the Separatists. Bail would feign interest in certain clandestine dealings, positioning himself as a senator who might be tempted to side with the Separatists if the right offer was made. They believed that if Palpatine truly was Sidious, he might try to manipulate Bail's stance for his own benefit. It was a perilous gambit, and success hinged on remaining completely undetected by the Chancellor's network of spies. In the midst of these tense preparations, Padmé felt a flicker of hope when Anakin Skywalker arrived back on Coruscant. He was still a Padawan under Obi-Wan's tutelage, but his reputation as the Chosen One had already grown. Though Padmé had not seen him for a while, the bond they shared on a personal level still glowed in her heart. The last time she had seen him, he was a brave but insecure boy. Now he was taller, more confident, yet still kind-hearted at his core. She found solace in their brief reunion, sensing that the nobility within him might offer much-needed support in this dark time. She thought about confiding her suspicions to him, but Obi-Wan cautioned her that Anakin was still young and prone to emotional impulses. The risk that Anakin might confront Palpatine recklessly was too great. Still, she could not entirely hide her anxiety from Anakin. One evening, he visited her apartment, and they shared a moment of quiet by the balcony, overlooking the endless skyscrapers of Coruscant. She tried to keep their conversation light, asking him about his missions and how his Jedi training was progressing. But she noticed his gaze linger on her face with concern. He asked gently if something was troubling her. She hesitated, torn between the desire to unburden her heart and the need to keep him safe from the knowledge that could put his life in jeopardy. She ended up telling him only that she was worried about the Republic, that she feared the politics of the moment might plunge them all into war. He offered reassurance, telling her that if war came, the Jedi would do everything in their power to restore peace. She forced a grateful smile, even as she kept the darkest secret locked away. Bail's trap for Palpatine was set in motion on a humid afternoon under the gray skies of Coruscant. Using encrypted channels, Bail sent out feelers to certain intermediary figures known to have connections with the Separatists, figures rumored to be under the influence of Sidious. He carefully structured the messages to sound as though he was disillusioned with the Republic's ineffective bureaucracy, hinting that if the Separatists could offer a viable alternative, Alderaan might consider supporting them. The notion that Alderaan, famed for its pacifist traditions, would even contemplate siding with the Separatists was so preposterous that it was guaranteed to raise eyebrows. Their hope was that Palpatine, if indeed Sidious, would take notice and try to manipulate Bail's new stance, drawing him into a secret dialogue. Obi-Wan and Padmé watched anxiously from the sidelines, waiting to see if Palpatine would respond in some incriminating way. For several days there was nothing, but on the sixth day, Bail received a cryptic invitation to a private meeting with the Chancellor. The message was polite and official, citing a desire to discuss Alderaan's concerns. Bail, Padmé, and Obi-Wan recognized immediately that it was a sign. Palpatine had taken the bait. The next step was to capture evidence of Palpatine saying something that linked him explicitly to the Separatist movement or to Sidious. That, however, would be far more difficult, especially given Palpatine's cunning. They prepared a hidden recording device that Obi-Wan had procured from the Jedi Temple's technology specialists, an advanced piece of equipment that would bypass standard scanning technology for concealed electronics. Bail carried it on him as he entered Palpatine's office. The Chancellor's domain was grand, Tall windows offering a panoramic view of Coruscant, plush carpeting, ornate furnishings. Palpatine greeted Bail with a sympathetic smile, expressing concern about Alderaan's rumored shift in loyalty. He spoke as a benevolent leader, carefully guiding the conversation to glean whether Bail was truly losing faith in the Republic. Bail played his part expertly, suggesting that the Senate was paralyzed, that the Chancellor's efforts, while commendable, might not be enough to prevent the worst outcomes. Palpatine's expression shifted subtly. He leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes fixed on Bail with an intensity that belied his soft tone. He spoke of the threat the Separatists posed, and how certain extraordinary measures might be required to hold the Republic together. He mentioned that a strong leader, someone with the backing of loyalists, could steer the Senate away from chaos. Bail pressed gently, asking if Palpatine had contacts or insights into the Separatist leadership that could expedite a peaceful resolution. Palpatine was too skillful to admit anything outright, responding with vague assurances. Still, his language betrayed a certain familiarity with the Separatists, more than one might expect from official intelligence. He hinted that Count Dooku and his allies were being guided by influences far darker than typical political ambition. Bail feigned confusion, pressing further, but Palpatine deflected artfully. By the end of the meeting, Bail was frustrated. Palpatine had revealed almost nothing concrete. Yet perhaps the device had captured subtle hints. Bail left the office, maintaining his facade until he was safely out of earshot. Only then did he exhale, feeling the tension release from his body. He rushed to a concealed location in the Senate building where Padmé and Obi-Wan waited. They played back the recording, hearts pounding. Palpatine's voice was calm, measured, revealing no direct confession. Yet there was a moment toward the end where he said something chilling. Count Dooku and his master think they have the upper hand. He did not name Sidious, nor did he implicate himself, but the slip was there. He admitted knowledge of a master. To their knowledge, Dooku's only known master was Sidious. While it was not the hard proof they had hoped for, it was a crack in Palpatine's facade. The question remained, would the Jedi Council see it as enough evidence to launch an official investigation? And if they did, would Palpatine's power base prove too strong, thwarting their efforts before they even began? Obi-Wan believed they needed more, perhaps direct evidence of Palpatine communicating with Dooku under the alias of Sidious. The group decided to push forward with their risky plan, aware that at any moment Palpatine might grow suspicious. As tension soared in the Senate, Padmé's own safety measures increased. She traveled with a larger security contingent, though she worried it might draw attention. Anonymous threats arrived at her office, cautioning her to support the Chancellor for the sake of the Republic, or to face dire consequences. She recognized the intimidation tactic for what it was. Each threat only hardened her resolve. She would not allow the Republic she loved to be destroyed from within by a hidden Sith Lord. Nor would she stand by while her fellow senators stumbled into a conflict orchestrated by the very leader who claimed to protect them. Late one evening, she found herself alone in her apartment once more, unable to sleep. She stared out at the endless cityscape. The same sense of dread that had once been a whisper was now a cacophony in her mind. She questioned the path she was on. In seeking to expose Palpatine, she risked war, chaos, and possibly her own life. But to remain silent would be to watch the Republic decay until Palpatine could crown himself with ultimate power. She closed her eyes, recalling the beauty of Naboo, the gentle rolling hills, the tranquil lakes, the community that had entrusted her with leadership at such a young age. She had vowed then to protect her people, to serve justice and democracy. That vow was etched into her very being. She would see it through, no matter the cost. Obi-Wan soon brought a sliver of hope. He learned that Dooku was rumored to be en route to a secret meeting somewhere in the Outer Rim, likely to coordinate the next phase of the Separatist movement. If he could intercept Dooku or at least discover some record of his communications, there might be a chance to link those transmissions directly to Palpatine. It was a dangerous mission, but one he was prepared to undertake. He told Padmé and Bail that if he was successful, the resulting evidence could be all the Council needed to act decisively. Padmé felt a surge of relief and fear intertwined. relief that the pieces were coming together, fear that Obi-Wan was walking into unimaginable danger. Little did they know that Palpatine was already several steps ahead. In the privacy of his own quarters, far away from prying eyes, he had cast aside the genial mask of the Chancellor. Draped in a dark cloak, his holographic communicator hummed with static as the image of Count Dooku flickered into view. Sidious's voice was cold and commanding. He inquired about Dooku's negotiations with various corporate alliances, ensuring the seeds of the Clone Wars were well planted. He spoke of the Senate's trembling indecision, of how events were converging to grant him emergency powers. Yet there was a hint of irritation in his tone as he mentioned a problem. Certain individuals were poking around too aggressively. He named Padmé Amidala, Bail Organa, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. He ordered Dooku to move forward with plans that would further destabilize the Republic, ensuring that the Senate would soon demand a grand army be formed under Sidious's watchful eye. The trap was closing. War was on the horizon, carefully orchestrated to serve Palpatine's dual identity. Padmé, Bail, and Obi-Wan knew time was running out, but they pressed forward, determined to expose him before the galaxy was engulfed in a conflict that would tear countless lives apart. As Padmé set aside her senatorial robes one night, slipping into her nightclothes, she ran through scenarios in her head. She dreamed of a moment when she could stand on the Senate floor, revealing indisputable evidence that the Chancellor was a Sith Lord. She imagined the collective gasp, the wave of horror, and the call to arms that would unify the Republic against him. She also imagined his reaction, the cold fury, the vow of retribution. Sometimes the vision ended in a triumphant restoration of democracy. Other times it ended with her lying on the cold marble floor of the rotunda, the victim of a final, deadly betrayal. When Obi-Wan set out for the Outer Rim to trail Dooku, Padmé redoubled her efforts on Coruscant. She put pressure on her allies in the Senate to question Palpatine's decisions more critically. She urged them to ask for transparent accounting of the emergency funds that had been allocated, for public hearings into the intelligence concerning separatist threats. Palpatine's office responded with carefully managed statements, deflecting her queries and labeling them as distractions. She could see the subtle shift in how certain senators treated her now, with caution, as though associating with her might be politically dangerous. Some avoided her in the hallways or gave rushed excuses to leave a conversation. The fear of Palpatine's power was a heavy yoke that few were willing to risk bearing. Still, she found pockets of support. Senators Mon Mothma, Gideon Danu, and others quietly reassured her that they too felt uneasy about the Chancellor's growing influence. They admitted they had heard rumors of shadowy manipulations but dared not speak publicly without firm evidence. Padmé provided them with what she could: fragments of suspicious transactions, discreet testimony from those who worked in Palpatine's inner circle. These revelations, though concerning, were not the proverbial smoking blaster needed to bring down a man of such authority and cunning. One evening, after a particularly volatile Senate session in which Palpatine narrowly pushed through a measure to expand the Judicial Department's surveillance authority, Padmé returned to her apartment exhausted. She sat alone, sipping a cup of tea, staring at the locked data files on her console. Within them lay every shred of evidence she had compiled. She felt a wave of despair, wondering if it would ever be enough. She closed her eyes, reflecting on the gravity of the path she had chosen, when suddenly a disturbance in the Force rippled outward. Though she was not Force-sensitive, a sense of dread filled her, as if the very air had turned to ice. Moments later, her comlink beeped. She picked it up and heard Anakin's voice, urgent and trembling. He spoke in rushed words, telling her that Obi-Wan's mission had gone awry, that Count Dooku had foreseen the Jedi's approach and laid a trap. Obi-Wan had been captured. Anakin was being sent with a group of Jedi to attempt a rescue, though the details were sparse. Padmé's heart clenched in her chest. She realized this might be the moment Sidious had been planning, the perfect excuse to escalate hostilities, to spark the very war he needed. She told Anakin to be careful, begging him not to take any unnecessary risks. Then, as she ended the communication, she knew she could not remain idle. Without wasting a moment, she reached out to Bail and the handful of sympathetic senators. They gathered in Bael's office under the pretense of a late-night legislative discussion. The group huddled around a small table, the lights dimmed, a hush in the air as they spoke of the news from the Outer Rim. If Obi-Wan was in danger, if a confrontation with Dooku was imminent, they might soon have the catalyst for open warfare. With unwavering resolve, Padmé insisted that they must present their evidence to the Jedi Council immediately, that they could no longer wait for the perfect moment. She feared that by the time they found an ideal scenario, the galaxy would already be on fire. Though they were nervous, the small circle of senators agreed. Bael arranged a clandestine meeting with Mace Windu and Yoda, ensuring it was off the record. Early the next morning, Padmé stood before the two senior Jedi Masters in a small meditation chamber. The glow of the rising sun filtered through narrow windows, illuminating the tense lines on her face. She explained everything, from her initial suspicion to the bits of evidence collected, from Palpatine's suspicious relationships to the encryption logs referencing Sidious. She recounted the slip he made in the private conversation with Bael and the ties to Count Dooku. Her voice trembled at times, but the conviction behind her words never wavered. Bael and the other senators corroborated her statements, providing data disks and statements from various witnesses. Mace Windu's face remained stern, brow furrowed in deep thought. Yoda closed his eyes, humming quietly as though trying to sense the force around them. When Padmé finished speaking, the two Jedi Masters conferred in low voices. Finally, Mace Windu addressed her. He admitted that the Council had long been concerned about the possibility of a Sith Lord lurking somewhere within the Republic's highest circles. They had not, however, definitively identified Palpatine as that Sith. While the evidence was alarming, it was still largely circumstantial. Yoda added that the dark side was clouding everything, making it difficult for the Jedi to see clearly. Still, the Council could not ignore what Padmé had presented. Yoda informed Padmé that he would convene the rest of the Council to discuss the matter, but he warned her. If Palpatine truly was Sidious, any direct move against him must be carefully orchestrated to avoid sparking chaos. He asked Padmé to exercise patience, to trust that the Jedi would act at the right time. Padmé bowed her head, knowing that the Jedi were cautious by nature, but fearing that caution might come too late. She left the chamber with Bael, uncertain of their next step. Mace Windu called after them, vowing that the Council would look deeper into the matter swiftly. True to their word, the Council quietly launched an internal investigation, cross-referencing Padmé's evidence with their own. Meanwhile, at the front lines of the developing conflict, events took a dangerous turn. Anakin, along with a cohort of Jedi and the newly discovered clone army on Kamino, whose origins were themselves suspect, engaged the Separatist forces in what would become known as the First Battle of Geonosis. The entire Republic was jolted as news spread of a massive droid army commanded by Dooku, and the deployment of clones under the banner of the Republic. In the Senate, panic took hold. Many senators who had wavered before now clamored for Palpatine to be granted emergency powers to address the crisis. Just as Padmé feared, the galaxy was on a collision course with total war. Padmé herself, upon hearing about Geonosis, took swift action. She arranged for an unsanctioned flight to the war-torn planet, despite the protest of her security entourage. She could not stand idly by while Obi-Wan and Anakin, not to mention countless others, risked their lives. Bael, who could not leave his duties on Coruscant, pleaded with her to be careful. She promised she would do whatever necessary to help end the conflict quickly, if indeed it could be ended. By the time she arrived, the battle was in full swing. Dust and smoke choked the arid Geonosian air, and the cacophony of blaster fire and explosions echoed across the barren terrain. She joined with the Jedi and clone troopers in a desperate struggle. It was the first time she had witnessed such large-scale warfare, and the sight of the clones, identical faces, unwavering discipline, filled her with awe and a certain disquiet. How had the Republic acquired this massive army so suddenly, and who truly controlled it? Despite the chaos, she managed to find Obi-Wan, who was injured but alive, and Anakin, whose right arm was severed in a duel with Dooku. They all narrowly escaped with their lives. In the aftermath, the Republic emerged victorious at Geonosis, but the cost was staggering. Thousands of clones perished, and the Separatists retreated to regroup. Most ominously, the war had officially begun. As they returned to Coruscant, the Senate lauded Palpatine for his leadership in assembling the clone army. He accepted the Senate's emergency powers to direct the war effort with a solemn expression, promising to relinquish them once the crisis had passed. Padmé stood amid the thunderous applause, her stomach twisting. She recognized the performance. He was positioning himself as the savior of the Republic, a carefully crafted image that would ensure loyalty and obedience. In the privacy of a recovery ward, where Obi-Wan and Anakin received medical attention, she gathered with them one last time before Obi-Wan would rejoin the Jedi Temple. She confessed that she believed the Clone Wars had been engineered, that they were playing directly into the hands of Sidious. Obi-Wan agreed, frustration evident in his eyes as he lamented the Jedi's inability to sense the Sith's manipulations sooner. Anakin listened quietly, his gaze distant, haunted by the violence he had witnessed and the pain of losing his arm. He did not fully understand the magnitude of what Padmé had uncovered, but he trusted her and Obi-Wan implicitly. Her final words to Obi-Wan that evening were filled with urgency. "We must find a way to expose him, before he consumes us all." Obi-Wan nodded, promising that he would rally what support he could within the Jedi ranks. But Anakin, for reasons Padmé could not fully grasp, seemed conflicted. He admired Palpatine, had considered him a mentor, someone who believed in his potential. The suggestion that Palpatine might be the Sith Lord behind the war was more than he could easily process. She saw the turmoil in his eyes, but there was no time to delve deeper. The lines were drawn, and the war machine roared to life. Days later, Padmé stood in her apartment once again, gazing out at the endless skyline of Coruscant. The news holos proclaimed the heroism of the clone troopers, the leadership of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, and the evil of the Separatists. Behind each word, she heard the whisper of Sidious's manipulation. This was a carefully staged production, and the galaxy had become its unwitting audience. She thought of the innocents across thousands of star systems who would soon bear the brunt of the coming battles. She closed her eyes, recalling the vow she had made to protect Naboo, to uphold justice and democracy. That vow extended now to all in the Republic. Even though war was upon them, even though the Senate cheered Palpatine's power, she would not surrender to despair. Her gaze moved to a small reflection of herself in the transparisteel window. She saw weariness etched into her features, an expression of grim resolve. A single tear traced down her cheek as she whispered to the city beyond, "I won't let this darkness consume us." Even if she had to stand alone against the tide of fear and deception, she would continue her search for truth. She would do what countless others in the Senate seemed unwilling or unable to do: resist the growing shadow. For behind the mask of a grandfatherly politician, she had glimpsed the monstrous reality of a Sith Lord named Sidious, the heir to Darth Plagueis' forbidden knowledge, a cunning manipulator who would stop at nothing to reshape the galaxy under his dominion. The war had begun, but the true battle was only just unfolding. As clones marched off to distant star systems, and the Separatists steeled themselves for counterstrikes, Padmé resolved that she would gather whatever allies she could. Jedi who were willing to look past tradition and see the threat at the heart of the Republic, senators who still believed in democracy, and even the common citizens who deserved to know the truth. Step by step, piece by piece, she would shed light on Palpatine's darkest secrets. Perhaps it was a fool's hope, but she clung to it with every fiber of her being. For all her exhaustion and doubt, she remembered why she was here: to protect the ideals of freedom and justice against any tyranny, even if that tyranny wore the face of a friend. In the months that followed, as the Clone Wars raged on multiple fronts, Padmé Amidala moved quietly and cautiously. She exchanged coded messages with Bail Organa, with Mon Mothma, and with other trusted senators, building a covert network of resistance. At every turn, Palpatine's political machinery sought to snuff out dissent, labeling critics as unpatriotic or even separatist sympathizers. Padmé endured veiled threats, smear campaigns, and watchful eyes that tracked her every public move. Yet she persevered, matching Palpatine's cunning with her own brand of strategic brilliance. She discreetly supported Obi-Wan, who covertly fed information about suspicious Jedi casualties and unexplainable logistical moves that always seemed to give Palpatine an edge. She also remained close to Anakin when she could, though he was increasingly swept up in the war effort, hailed as a hero. The seeds of confusion in his mind were evident. He wrestled with loyalty to Palpatine, the man who had always encouraged him, and his respect for Padmé and Obi-Wan, who spoke of a grand conspiracy. Padmé sensed that Palpatine intentionally fed Anakin's ego, nurturing the young man's thirst for validation. It was a subtle yet potent form of control, one she feared might eventually ensnare him completely. Through it all, the Senate sessions became more surreal. With each Republican victory, the Senate applauded Palpatine's steady hand. With each near defeat, they pleaded for him to take even stronger measures, to centralize command further, to grant broader powers to the office of the Chancellor. It was as if the majority of senators were blind to the pattern, or willfully ignoring it. Padmé refused to let despair take root. Her small alliance of conscientious senators grew bit by bit, bolstered by the occasional leak of evidence. Logistics showing that the war was being prolonged, or that certain separatist worlds were not as firmly against the Republic as portrayed. But for every step they took forward, Palpatine's grip tightened, using the war as a shield to obscure his deeper designs. In private moments, Padmé wondered if it might have turned out differently had she exposed Palpatine before the Clone Wars began in earnest. Perhaps if she had confronted him directly, or gone to the Council sooner with more definitive proof, the entire crisis could have been averted. But the reality was more complex. Palpatine had planned for every contingency, weaving a labyrinth of manipulations that even the shrewdest minds struggled to navigate. She tried not to dwell on regrets. Instead, she focused on what she could still accomplish. Her conviction remained unwavering. The truth would be revealed, no matter how skillfully Palpatine tried to hide it. One night, as she studied a fresh batch of data showing suspicious troop deployments, she felt a familiar ache of loneliness. She closed her datapad and walked to the balcony, letting the cool night air of Coruscant brush against her. It was eerily quiet at this hour, the usual traffic diminished to a trickle. She looked out across the vast skyline, remembering the early days when she first arrived as Queen of Naboo, full of optimism about the Republic's democratic ideals. The transformation of Coruscant into the seat of an emerging dictatorship under a Sith Lord felt like a nightmare she could not shake. She found her gaze drifting upward, to the stars barely visible through the city's glow. Somewhere out there, in countless star systems, people were fighting and dying in a war orchestrated by the one man sworn to protect them. It weighed heavily on her conscience that she carried secrets that could reveal the truth. Yet to unleash those secrets prematurely was to risk open confrontation with a Sith Lord whose power was nigh immeasurable. She thought of her people back on Naboo, of her family and friends who trusted her to make the right choices. She whispered to the wind, "I will not fail you." The vow lingered in the stillness of the night, a quiet promise forged from desperation and hope. That promise gave her strength in the dark hours. She knew Palpatine was cunning beyond measure, and that his infiltration ran deep. But he had not broken her spirit, nor had he extinguished the Republic's last bastion of conscience. As the Clone Wars escalated, and Palpatine's star rose ever higher, Padmé Amidala prepared to stand against the tide. She had discovered his secret identity before the first shots of the war were fired, and though it had not prevented the conflict, it had galvanized her to fight back. And in that hidden fight, a war of information and truth, she would not rest until the shadow of Darth Sidious was banished from the Republic, or until her last breath was spent in the attempt. In the lingering hush of Coruscant's night, she pressed her hand against the railing of the balcony, steeling herself for the battles yet to come. She imagined Palpatine in his dark cloak, orchestrating the future from behind a kindly smile. She thought of the ancient lore of Darth Plagueis, the whispered tales of unnatural powers passed down to an ambitious apprentice. She had no illusions about the danger she faced, but she was resolute. If the galaxy was to endure, if the ideals of democracy were to stand any chance of surviving, then she had to keep searching for a way to expose the Sith Lord hidden at the heart of the Republic. And so she stood there, a solitary figure against the glow of the city, unbowed by the magnitude of the darkness she had discovered, determined to shine a light upon it no matter the cost.